This lecture accompanies chapter 19, and that chapter is on counseling Arab Americans and Muslim Americans. I think your book does a very good job of differentiating the two. I'd like for you to make sure that you read up on the difference between Arabs and Muslims, and oftentimes these two are confused or conflated, and really they are not the same. Arabs are individuals from certain countries. You can see here this PowerPoint identifies Arabs generally come from Middle East and North Africa and primarily speak Arabic, whereas Muslims follow Islam. And so it's not necessarily related to what country the individual comes from or what language they speak, and that Muslims and Arabs are not the same thing, and not all Muslims are Arabs. And know that within that there are two sects within Islam, and that's the Sunni and the Shiite. So read up on that. This might be important. This might be an important question to ask your clients, so you know sort of that philosophy and how that relates to maybe potential problems or goals that they may be wanting to address, and more specifically, how to relate to them culturally. It is important to know that when working with Muslims, that Muslims follow Islamic law, and that dictates issues around society and social issues, family life, economics, sexuality, and just sort of general aspects of life. Your book does again another good job at talking about sort of the cultural and religious values espoused in the Quran. You can see here in this PowerPoint that there are some very important familial values and sort of the structure and hierarchy of the family and the family structure within Muslim Americans and for Arab Americans, and that the family structure and the value system between these two are not necessarily always the same, and they differ depending upon what area of the country and level of I guess being acclimated to the United States the individuals have. So you know, as we've talked about with other sort of cultures or other marginalized groups, that families tend to be sort of family focused, that collectivist perspective versus individual perspective, and they are patriarchal. And then there are some very specific roles for men and very specific roles for women. Women are predominantly responsible for, as you can see here, childcare and homemaking. One important thing that I think we need to discuss is that discussions around the opposite sex are frowned upon. They don't look at, they are not looked upon favorably in terms of discussing these outside of the home. So you can imagine, as counselors, this is something that we would regularly have counseling sessions and discussions around, and this may be sort of a barrier for you and your client, and it may be something that you need to explore right off the bat when considering referrals and or accepting a client. That, you know, determining whether or not being of the opposite sex and or having these conversations could potentially be problematic for your client. Again, as I mentioned, Arab Americans and Muslim Americans tend to take this collectivist approach or collectivist sort of stance versus the idealist or individualistic stance, as most sort of Americans and this Eurocentric society tends to do. We tend to place more of a focus on individuality. This is not the case when it comes to Arab Americans and Muslim Americans. You can see here that family and community support is considered to be quite protective, and considered to be pretty influential. And so it may be difficult for an individual, an Arab American or Muslim American individual, to reach out to get help from someone other than a community member or a family member. So, that might be something that you just want to explore right off the bat and talk about, issues and concerns that they may have related to seeking services outside of their community and outside of their family. Of course, as with most minority and marginalized groups, there are certain specific challenges as they relate to stereotypes and discrimination. And then, of course, racism. Your book goes into describe Muslim Americans and Arab Americans being as sort of discriminated against only second to Jewish Americans. And we talked about that Jewish Americans were the most discriminated against groups in the United States and elsewhere in the world, and Arab Americans and Muslim Americans are second to Jewish Americans. And so, of course, since 9/11, that has astronomically increased for Arab and Muslim Americans. Your book mentions some interesting and some startling sort of quotes and data. People tend to believe that there are certain terrorist or barbarian-esque roles for individuals who are, in film that are Arab or Muslim Americans, and that they're always sort of the bad guy, and that there's this malicious intent behind anyone who is Arab or Muslim American that is against that of the United States. And so we need to be, I think that's probably, one of the bigger takeaways from this chapter is making sure that you are checking in with your bias and your prejudice around this minority and marginalized group, and seeking consultation and supervision if you uncover those biases and prejudices. I certainly think that's true when working with any population, but particularly since this group, along with Jewish Americans, tends to sort of be at the be more discriminated against. I think it's imperative that we as counselors are mindful of sort of, again, asking your client, talk to me about how you identify, talk to me about your culture, talk to me about your practices, teach me about you before we start working. Okay, this is a relatively quick chapter, so that's all I'm going to say about this. We can certainly discuss this again in class when we meet.